So this video is on transversal equations. We'll review the transversal angles first and then look at how that applies to solving equations. So our essential question is, how can I find the measures of angles within transversals? And so of course if we have that transversal, then we need to first have two parallel lines, at least two parallel lines. And underneath there, or right beside there, I'm just going to show the symbol for parallel, just so you remember that. And those parallel lines will be cut by a transversal in order to have the pairs that we go over. You will probably want to have a few different colors with you today as you're taking these notes. So if you need to pause and then go grab a few colored pencils or some highlighters, that's what you want to do. So the first kind of transversal pairs that I'm going to point out are corresponding angles. Corresponding angles are in the same relative place. So what you need to watch there first, or realize first, is that we have the two parallel lines, and then those parallel lines are cut by the transversal. And that transversal right here creates angle pairs, and so in two sets of angles. So we have one set of angles and then another set of angles. Wherever the transversal and the parallel line meet, that gives you two sets of angles. So we'll take those marks out of the way, and we have to look at those pairs. So corresponding angles are going to be in the same relative place along the transversal. So angle 1 is going to be congruent to angle 5 because they are corresponding angles. And so on the bottom here, I'm also going to say, okay, angle 1 is congruent, there's that symbol for congruent, to angle 5 because they're corresponding angles. Now I'm going to switch colors to mark another corresponding pair. You should do the same, just switch your colors here. And I'm going to say, okay, so angle 2 is congruent and corresponding to angle 6. You see how they're in the same place? 2 is in the upper right, 6 is in the upper right of its group. So angle 2 is congruent to angle 6 because they are corresponding. Then again, I'm going to switch colors to another corresponding pair. Angle 3 is congruent to angle 7 because they are corresponding. So angle 3 is congruent to angle 7 because they are corresponding. And then we have a fourth corresponding pair, and that is angle 4 corresponding to angle 8. So I would write angle 4 is congruent to angle 8. So I know that those pairs of corresponding angles have the same measures in those pairs. So the next kind of angle pair we're going to talk about are vertical angles. And again, we're talking about parallel lines and a transversal and the pairs that they create. Now, vertical angles are also congruent to one another, and that's what makes them important to be able to spot. But where they're paired up are different from the corresponding angles. So here we have angle 1 is vertical to angle 4. So those are a vertical angle pair. So for vertical angles, angle 1 must be congruent to angle 4 because they are vertical angles. Angle 2 is vertical to angle 3. They are across from each other when two lines intersect. So angle 2 will be congruent to angle 3. So again, trying to identify the angle pairs, but then also recognizing the reason we want to be able to identify them is to know that their measurements match each other. And for what reason? So another vertical pair, hopefully you can start to spot them here. Angle 5 is vertical to angle 8. So I'd write angle 5 is congruent to angle 8, and they are congruent because they're a vertical angle pair. And angle 6 is a vertical angle pair or congruent to angle 7. So those are your pairs of vertical angles created by parallel lines and a transversal. So alternate interior angles are another kind of congruent pair. The alternate means that it alternates sides of the transversal. So just kind of keying into those words there. And the interior part means inside the parallel lines. So inside the parallel lines. So if we're talking about inside the parallel lines, then we are not talking about 1 and 2 or 7 and 8. So just kind of focusing on that. So alternate interior angles would be like angle 3 is congruent to angle 6 as an alternate interior pair. So I could say angle 3 is congruent to angle 6 because they are alternate interior angles. And angle 4 is congruent to angle 5 because they are alternate interior angles. So alternate exterior angles, another pair. Again, alternate is going to stand for opposite sides of the transversal. And exterior is going to be on the outside of the parallel lines. So if we're talking about outside the parallel lines, then we are not talking about anything in between the parallel lines. So that rules out 3, 4, 5, and 6. So for alternate exterior angles, angle 1 is congruent to angle 8 because they are alternate exterior. Angle 1 is congruent to angle 8 as alternate exterior. And angle 2 is congruent to angle 7 as alternate exterior. So the next kind of angle pairs are not necessarily congruent pairs. Typically they're not going to be. They're supplementary, which means they're going to add up to 180. And sometimes they're a linear pair, which means they're going to add up to 180 and be right next to each other. So there are a lot of supplementary pairs created when a transversal crosses parallel lines. So we have the kind that are linear pairs that are like right next to each other. And so to kind of look at that, we want to look at, where at a vertex, where at a corner do two angles make a 180. Okay, so we can see that the measure of angle 1 and the measure of angle 2, measure of angle 1 plus the measure of angle 2 is equal to 180 degrees. And we can also look at that between 1 and 3. So the measure of angle 1 plus the measure of angle 3 would be equal to 180 degrees. And those are those kind of adjacent pairs. We could see that same relationship between angle 2 and angle 4. We could say the measure of angle 2 plus the measure of angle 4 is equal to 180 degrees. So we have a lot of linear pairs here. And then we can kind of go down on the lower portion. Oh, actually, we still have another one here. We have angle 4 and angle 3. So we could say the measure of angle 4 plus the measure of angle 3 is equal to 180 degrees. So a lot of pairs just on that top section. And the same relationships would exist down below on the kind of lower section. So we could say, 5 and 6 are a linear pair. So the measure of angle 5 plus the measure of angle 6 would equal 180. And we can say 5 and 7 are a linear pair, and those measures would equal 180. And 6 and 8, and 7 and 8. So kind of all those linear pairs. Or I wrote a few of them, but you could write them all down if you want. Now, the other kind of thing you want to look at on the other half of the drawing here is we've got our same angle numbers, is that there are also supplementary angles that are not right next to each other. They don't make that arch, but they do add up to 180. Like angle 1 and angle 6, those would add up to 180. So I could say the measure of angle 1 plus the measure of angle 6 is equal to 180 degrees. We just need one that's obtuse and one that's acute in the linear pair because 6 is congruent to 2, and 1 and 2 are a linear pair, then 1 and 6 make 180. So let's look at that. Here, let's find another one here, like angle 2 and angle 8 would be supplementary. So the measure of angle 2 plus the measure of angle 8 is 180 degrees. Again, those are not a linear pair because they're not adjacent, but if 2 happens to be the same as 7, and 7 and 8 are supplementary, then 2 and 8 are supplementary as well. So find another pair of supplementary but not adjacent or not a linear pair. Okay, you could say 3 and 5. So I could say the measure of angle 3 plus the measure of angle 5 is equal to 180 degrees. And there are other pairs that we could name as well. All right, so for the next section, we're just kind of looking at those relationships between the angles, and then we're going to use those to solve equations. So you have to, just like on that last equation solving one, you have to first identify the relationship between the angles. So looking at the two angles that are here, what kind of angle pair are they? Well, those happen to be alternate exterior angles. So these are alternate exterior angles. And what do I know about alternate exterior angles? I know that they are congruent. You will need to kind of practice with those to just learn the relationships. Okay, so if those angles are congruent or the same measure, then that tells me I can create an equation from them. So I just have to say, okay, I know that their measures are equal, so that means I can set their measures equal mathematically in an equation. And then you would solve that equation. So I'm going to subtract 14 from both sides. Get 4x here is equal to 148. Divide both sides by 4. X is equal to 37. Now remember that is just your x, that is not your angle measurement. The angle measurement was 4x plus 14. So we want to make sure that we solve for x correctly, and that if we solved it correctly, we would get the 162 that was the other angle, and we do get that. So we know we have the right solution. Now we do want to find the other missing angles because that was in the instructions. So here we're going to say, okay, this is 162, so I found my x. To find the other missing angle, we have to recognize that we have other pairs. Like this would be a linear pair, so they would add up to 180. So I can say, okay, 180 minus 162, and that's going to give me 18 degrees for the other angle. So I can put that in. Now what about all the other missing angles? Well, that's where you go into your other pairs. We have vertical angles. That would be the same. So I can say, okay, vertical angles that are matching. And this angle here, let me choose a different color here. This angle here would be alternate exterior with this one. And so this angle with 18 degrees would be alternate exterior with this angle, so that is also 18 degrees. And then we have vertical angles. Okay, and we would have, if we look carefully, we've got alternate interior angles there. So if this one is 162, then this one is also 162. So as you start to recognize the patterns and recognize the angle pairs, you can start filling in all sorts of angle measurements. Alright, so this next one is your turn. You want to tell me what kind of angle pair is shown. So you're trying to figure out what kind of angle pair is right here, is shown with the variables inside. Okay, those are corresponding angles. They are both in the lower right hand of their angle set. And corresponding angles are congruent, so you can set them equal to each other. So because they are a congruent pair, you can set them equal to each other. And then from there you can solve. And we get that x is equal to 12. Now remember, that's not your angle measurement. You just get that x is 12. So we need to plug back in and say, okay, if my angle measurement was 5x plus 12, so I'm going to plug that 12 back in there. Okay, and I end up with 60 plus 12, and that gives me 72. Now I do want to check the other expression just to make sure that they come out the same, because they are supposed to be the same. And so here I get 84 minus 12, and that also gives me 72 degrees, so that's good. We do want them to match since they were corresponding angles. And so I've got, when I fill in here, I know that this one is 72 degrees. I know that this angle is 72 degrees. Now if I want to fill in the other measurements, I've got to kind of think about, okay, well, then I can look at all the angles that would be congruent to the 72 that I already have. That would be the vertical angle to the lower 72 here, and this would be 72 also. Again, partly finding patterns, partly knowing angle relationships. And then I know that I have linear pairs, so I can take 180 degrees and subtract the 72, and that gives me 108. And so that gives me the other measurements for like the linear pair, and then vertical to that, and what would be corresponding angles to the vertical angle, and then vertical to that one. So you get to fill in all the others once you know what the supplement was to the one that you found. So again, when we have an example, you've got to decide what kind of pair they are, what is their relationship. So we're looking at what kind of relationship does this angle and this angle have. And that is not one of our more evident pairs. So let's see if you can identify what kind of relationship these two angles would have. These two angles are supplementary. So they would add up to 180 degrees, and we can use that to create the equation. So if we know that they're supplementary, then we can add their measurements, so adding the two expressions, and we know that that would have to add up to 180 degrees, so we can create the equation from that. Then we just go ahead and solve our equation. We have like terms with the variables, and we have like terms with our constants. So let's go ahead and solve from there. We've got 4x plus 28 to simplify that expression before we solve. And then we would be subtracting 28 from both sides. And that's going to give us 4x is equal to 152. And dividing by 4. And we get that x is 38. And now remember, the x is not your angle measurement. X is just your x that you plug in. So you've got to find your angle measurements. So we start with 2x plus 26. We're going to plug in the 38 for x. And we get there 76 plus 26. That's going to give us 102 degrees for that. Now, again, just realizing the angle pairs, there's a lot you can fill in once you have that. And then you have the other expression. Where we would plug in our x. And for that we get 78 degrees. 78 degrees. And so we can fill that in for our other missing angles. So using our angle pairs and using our equation solving skills, we can find a lot of missing measurements with transversals and parallel lines.